Vamos a agradecer la presencia de cada uno y cada una de ustedes y vamos a saludar muy especialmente a Pilar Romaguera, rectora de Universidad de las Américas, a los miembros de la Junta Directiva presentes de nuestra universidad, a autoridades de otras instituciones de educación superior, de gobierno y de otras instituciones nacionales, a nuestros vicerrectores, decanos y autoridades administrativas, por supuesto a nuestros estudiantes, egresados y egresadas, y a todos y todas quienes están conectados hoy para ser parte de esta importante conferencia. Queremos dar una especial bienvenida a los directores y profesores de las comunidades educativas de los colegios que trabajan con nuestra universidad. Y por supuesto, a nuestro invitado de honor, el señor Andreas Schleicher, director de Educación y Competencias de la OCDE, quien hoy realizará una presentación sobre educación y pandemia. Muchísimas gracias por estar hoy con nosotros. Para comenzar entonces, dejamos con ustedes a Pilar Romaguera, rectora de nuestra universidad.
Gracias y buenos días. Un cordial saludo a todos quienes nos acompañan, estudiantes, académicos, autoridades y profesionales, así como también a las comunidades de colegios, directivos, profesoras y profesores. A todos quienes les apasiona la educación, porque creemos que en ella está la oportunidad de crecer y progresar como sociedad. Muy especialmente agradecer a nuestro invitado en esta inauguración del Año Académico 2021, quien es uno de los especialistas que más sabe de educación a nivel mundial. El director de Educación y Competencias de la OCDE, Andreas Schleicher. Andreas, thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation and welcome to our university. Hoy inauguramos oficialmente el Año Académico de Universidad de las Américas y es imposible no mirar, aunque sea rápidamente, los acontecimientos recientes. Estos últimos 14 meses ha sido un periodo complejo que nos ha obligado, desde las estructuras institucionales hasta cada uno de nuestros profesores, colaboradores y estudiantes, a adaptarnos y desarrollar nuevas habilidades para sobrellevar la crisis sanitaria global y sus consecuencias. Como ha ocurrido en prácticamente todos los centros de formación superior en nuestro país, en nuestra universidad nos volcamos al trabajo virtual, empujados por la emergencia sanitaria de la COVID-19. Ello desafió a toda nuestra comunidad y principalmente a nuestros estudiantes, quienes con un alto grado de compromiso dedicaron todo su esfuerzo para adaptarse a una modalidad de educación online, logrando obtener resultados positivos, valorados por las autoridades educacionales y que también nos han abierto nuevos e interesantes caminos, no solo en la docencia a distancia, sino también en nuestra conexión con comunidades muy diversas, con expertos nacionales y extranjeros, en más de 200 webinars, con más de 35.000 participantes, coronadas con una jornada inaugural como la del día de hoy. Así, nuestros estudiantes cuentan actualmente con un completo sistema de plataformas de e-learning, Blackboard, Moodle y Canvas, apoyados por Zoom Educacional, con el fin de asegurar una buena comunicación sincrónica, porque en estos tiempos la buena comunicación es primordial. Se ha logrado avanzar en las actividades prácticas. Se creó un centro virtual de prácticas profesionales para diversas carreras, además del centro de simulación hospitalaria para los programas de salud. Se ha incorporado nuevo software como Body Interact o herramientas colaborativas como Slack, con buenos resultados. Y más recientemente implementamos más de 70 salas HiFlex para la realización de clases híbridas. Esto ha sido posible gracias a la experiencia que como institución teníamos en metodologías virtuales, en el acompañamiento y apoyo que proveían las aulas virtuales. Pero sin duda, como lo he mencionado, lo logrado se debe al esfuerzo de toda la comunidad universitaria. Una vez más, mis agradecimientos a cada uno de ustedes. En esta inauguración del año académico, queremos relevar el rol de la educación en el actual contexto y ofrecer una mirada amplia de la situación y desafíos futuros del sistema educativo. La OCDE, y particularmente su área de educación y competencias, lleva más de 2 décadas generando información a partir de datos que recoge de manera estandarizada en los países miembros de la organización y también en países asociados. Detrás de siglas como PISA, TALIS o PIAAC, existe un enorme trabajo que genera información que nos permite analizar nuestros sistemas educativos en una realidad comparada. Este trabajo que ha desarrollado la OCDE ha sido fundamental para el diseño e implementación de políticas públicas en educación, tanto por las evaluaciones que realizan como también por la generación de espacios de encuentro y colaboración entre países. Uno de los programas más conocidos es el Programa para la Evaluación Internacional de Estudiantes, PISA, que se inició el año 2000 para medir la adquisición de competencias esenciales para desenvolverse en la sociedad en los jóvenes de 15 años que están cerca de finalizar su escolaridad obligatoria. Nuestro invitado es reconocido como el padre de PISA. Chile comenzó a participar en PISA desde el año 2001. Hemos estado presentes en 6 de los 7 ciclos de aplicación de esta prueba. Los resultados de los jóvenes chilenos han mostrado una trayectoria creciente, mayor en lectura que en matemáticas. Sin embargo, el aumento más importante se produjo en la década del 2000 y se observa un estancamiento en los últimos estudios de los años 2015 y 2018. En esta última aplicación, Chile alcanza el mejor desempeño general entre los países latinoamericanos, pero desigual y bajo el promedio de los países de la OCDE. Por cierto, esto indica que tenemos cruciales desafíos de mejora de nuestro sistema educativo. Más aún cuando la pandemia global también ha impactado los procesos de aprendizaje de niños y jóvenes, poniendo en riesgo los logros alcanzados por escasos que estos parezcan. Y más aún, la pandemia amenaza con acrecentar las brechas educativas ya existentes entre distintos segmentos de nuestra sociedad. Es un dato que no solo los informes de la OCDE, sino también otros organismos han constatado. Lamentablemente, las inequidades educativas que enfrentan los hogares y que impiden que las sociedades avancen en mayor justicia e igualdad se han agravado en este tiempo. La adaptación frente a la pandemia ha sido compleja en el mundo escolar y más compleja que en el universitario. Y las brechas entre estudiantes e instituciones mayores. Uno de los hechos más graves, productos de la pandemia, tiene que ver con el cierre de las escuelas y las actividades presenciales en este nivel educativo, y las posteriores dificultades tecnológicas de adaptación de muchas de ellas. Las escuelas, particularmente en los países de nuestra región, son instituciones fundamentales para las comunidades locales. Además de llevar adelante la educación formal, son espacios de socialización y aún de alimentación y cuidado de algunos de nuestros niños y niñas. Para las comunidades escolares y particularmente para los y las docentes, estos 14 meses han implicado desafíos mayores. Hay que recordar que la mayor parte de ellos se encuentra teletrabajando desde sus casas, teniendo que atender así también las demandas internas de su propio hogar. Luego, podremos escuchar algunos testimonios de directivos y docentes que reflejan el esfuerzo desplegado por las comunidades educativas para que las actividades formativas ocurran en este contexto tan complejo. No es casual que para inaugurar el año académico de nuestra universidad nos queramos referir al ámbito escolar. Y esto es porque para el acceso y permanencia en la educación superior, para que este acceso y permanencia sea equitativo y posible, dependemos de lo que suceda en la educación escolar, en que el desarrollo cognitivo está en pleno y no da lo mismo cuándo y en qué condiciones se van desarrollando en nuestros niños sus habilidades y competencias. Es por ello que a través de nuestra Facultad de Educación hemos procurado apoyar de la mejor manera posible a nuestros centros de práctica, a sus profesoras y profesores. Estoy convencida que las universidades tenemos un rol fundamental para que las trayectorias educativas a lo largo de la vida sean posibles. Primero y obviamente en la formación de docentes, pero en las circunstancias actuales también contribuyendo a superar el déficit y las brechas educativas que se están generando a nivel escolar. Queremos motivar el apoyo de las universidades, promover un mayor acercamiento e integración hacia la educación escolar en su quehacer. En particular, nos comprometemos a continuar generando instancias de diálogo y reflexión sobre educación, que junto a otras iniciativas esperamos sean un aporte en el camino hacia una mejor, más equitativa e inclusiva educación para los niños, jóvenes y adultos de nuestro país. Finalmente, quiero reiterar que es realmente un privilegio contar el día de hoy con el profesor Andreas Schleicher, culminando nuestro ciclo de inauguraciones académicas. A la vez, con esta inauguración damos inicio también a una serie de conferencias en educación que desarrollaremos durante el resto del año y a la cual les invitamos a participar desde ya. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, rectora. Continuamos esta inauguración de Año Académico de Universidad de las Américas con la presentación del director de Educación y Competencias, Andreas Schleicher, quien, como lo ha indicado nuestra rectora, tiene una vasta trayectoria en educación y una de las más completas visiones que existen en la actualidad acerca de las realidades educacionales de los diferentes países que pertenecen a la OCDE. Antes de darle la palabra, vamos a presentar una serie de videos testimoniales con directores de escuela que pertenecen a los centros de práctica de la Facultad de Educación de nuestra universidad, para que podamos escuchar directamente de su voz cómo ha sido su experiencia en pandemia.
Mi nombre es Raúl Astudillo Rubio, yo soy director del Liceo Abdón Cifuentes de Conchalí. Tiene 1170 estudiantes desde pre-kinder hasta cuarto medio. Otro aspecto positivo que puedo rescatar de esta situación fue la vinculación con los docentes, ¿no? ¿Verdad? Se generó un trabajo mucho más estrecho en lo colaborativo y se lograron articulaciones que no habíamos logrado durante años anteriores.
La escuela particular Christ School se encuentra ubicada en la comuna de Maipú. Atiende niños desde kinder a octavo año básico. Al hacer un balance de mi experiencia como director durante la pandemia, puedo destacar el haber mantenido la unidad del equipo directivo como pilar de la escuela, buscando la contención de nuestro equipo docente y a través de ellos la de nuestros alumnos y sus familias.
El colegio se encuentra en Pudahuel, tiene una capacidad máxima de 1.350 estudiantes. La verdad es que los docentes del colegio tuvieron que aprender súper rápido tecnologías, cosas que antes quizás nos hubiésemos demorado mucho más tiempo en aprender. Tuvimos que aprender en 2 semanas.
Para nuestros estudiantes, lo más difícil fue el no poder compartir con sus compañeros y profesores, no tener el contacto en los recreos y en muchas ocasiones la frustración de no entender una tarea y no tener a quién consultarle en el momento.
El mayor desafío ha sido mantener justamente la motivación de los estudiantes. Yo creo que esa es una problemática a nivel nacional y la motivación de los estudiantes fue muy compleja.
La motivación yo creo que aquí ha sido fundamental con los profesores, hacia los profesores, y la comunicación constante. Juntarnos solo a conversar de cómo están y no hablar siempre de las planificaciones o en la clase que vamos, una metodología distinta.
Lo más difícil para todos fue ir conociendo cómo la pandemia afectaba a nuestros niños. En algunos casos, contagios, pérdida de sus familiares, en otros, la pérdida de la fuente laboral de sus padres.
Bueno, yo creo que lo más difícil de enfrentar a los profesores fue, a pesar de que la herramienta de la tecnología fue importante y potente en el establecimiento de la relación virtual, ¿no? Fue justamente la carencia de manejos profundo en el manejo de la tecnología.
Lo más difícil, yo creo que tanto como profesores y estudiantes, ha sido el tema de la conexión a clases. Por eso el trabajo de los profesores al principio fue muy de hormiguita, porque teníamos que hacer este catastro para poder entregar tecnologías a nuestros estudiantes.
Lo sorprendente de nuestros niños es el deseo de volver a su escuela, la preocupación cuando sabían que uno de sus compañeros la estaba pasando mal.
Lo que más me ha impresionado y me seguirá impresionando de los estudiantes es la capacidad de adaptabilidad que han tenido frente a este cambio.
Lo que más me ha impresionado de los estudiantes es la motivación. Y de hecho hemos tenido actividades, elección del centro de estudiantes, y claro, y fue un voto a través del computador o del tablet o del teléfono. Este año están súper motivados.
Ahí están los testimonios. Enviamos nuevamente un cariñoso saludo a las comunidades educativas con las que trabaja nuestra universidad. Antes de darle la palabra al profesor Schleicher, les recordamos que esta presentación cuenta con traducción simultánea, pudiendo cada uno de ustedes elegir el canal, ya sea en inglés, donde va a estar la voz de Andreas Schleicher, o bien la versión en castellano, que simultáneamente se transmitirá en el canal que así lo indica, con español. La herramienta la encontrarán abajo a la derecha y su icono es un globo terráqueo. Así también los invitamos a realizar preguntas a través de la plataforma en la sección preguntas y respuestas. Estas serán recogidas para luego ser abordadas al final de la presentación. Así es que ahora, sin más demora, damos la bienvenida a Andreas Schleicher.
Thank you very much, Pilar, and also Marie-Ines. It's a pleasure to share this session with you. Obviously, you know, these are very difficult times, and we have just heard this from the testimonials, and this crisis has amplified the many inadequacies and also inequalities in our education systems. Now, where students had learned how to learn, where they had access to great, you know, technologies, a very supportive ecosystem at home and at school. For them, that experience, you know, might have been liberating and exciting. They learned in so many more interesting ways during the pandemic. But for the many young students who used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, you know, learning little bits and pieces of knowledge, maybe not so motivated even, you know, who did not have daily support and interaction with teachers, not the possibility to be supported by their parents, not having great access to technology, they have been left very badly behind. That is, I think, the biggest lesson we can take from the pandemic. Also, that the pandemic has basically not just, you know, amplified inequalities, but it has also taught us that learning is not a transactional phenomenon. It's always a relational, a social phenomenon. We just heard, you know, students liking to go back to university. So let me just show some data with you on this. And I want to start with something that obviously, you know, is at the heart of the discussion everywhere, and it's school closures and the opportunities they have affected. If you look at this across countries, the learning time, the number of instruction that were lost in high school, for example, you can see in some countries it was quite modest. In countries like Denmark or Germany or New Zealand, it was very modest. Costa Rica and Colombia have essentially lost the entire school year. And then most countries are in the middle. And you can also find Chile at a relatively favorable situation. What I must say here, though, this is full school closures. Chile opened voluntarily. So basically here, I just show the period where schools were fully closed up to July. So in relative terms, even though, you know, school closures have been very disruptive in Chile as well, Chile has been luckier than many other countries, particularly in the Americas, where schools have been really closed for a very long time. Now I show you something that might surprise you. You know, when I factor into the pandemic into this, and my apologies for presenting this in English, but the size of the bubbles basically tells you the infection rate in the year 2020, so last year. The bigger the bubble, the more severely a country was hit by COVID. The smaller the bubble, sort of the lower the infection rate. And what you can see from this chart that actually, school closures had very little to do with the infection rates. You can see some countries that were very badly hit by COVID that were able to keep schools open. The country where I live, France, Germany, now they're quite in a good position. You can see some countries where the COVID was not so bad, but, they were not ready to keep schools running. So it's a very interesting finding that we are not just talking about COVID here. We're talking about the capacity of school systems to be resilient to disruptions. Let me bring one more aspect into this, and that is the quality of education itself, as we measure it through our international PISA assessments. When I put the countries in a bar like this, you can see a very different picture. The COVID infection rates do not predict school closures very well. But the quality of education is a very powerful predictor of school closures. You can see, where countries are doing well on the PISA assessment, they managed to do relatively well during the pandemic. Where they did poorly, on PISA, they closed their schools for long periods of time. But the story is not about PISA. PISA is just an indicator for something else. It's an indicator for education. High performance on PISA is an indicator for education systems that have a lot of frontline capacity, that have teachers who are imaginative, who have resources which they can use creatively, who can change learning environment, who can quickly introduce social distancing requirements, who can change the school organization, create safe spaces, sometimes, do COVID testing in the school. Where education systems are performing well, where they have a lot of frontline capacity, they are resilient to disruptions. Where education systems are organized in very traditional hierarchical ways, they tell their teachers what to do, right? Very industrial. You can see there's a disruption and the education system collapses. All schools are closed. I exaggerate a bit, but I think that's the message really that is coming out from this now. And that's a very powerful message for the future. Where we develop a lot of, ingenuity, a lot of frontline capacity, our education systems are resilient to disruptions. And the future will always surprise us. The COVID pandemic is just one thing that happened. The future will always surprise us. So making our education systems more resilient is really about building more, resilience into education in the front line. At least that's, what I take away from this chart. So with this, let's have a little bit more detailed look into the pandemic. Now, first of all, there's still a lot of disruption in education. Now, when I look, for example, particularly in the higher levels of education, in secondary education, you can still see a lot of schools which are closed, in Chile and many other countries. Few countries have been able to keep school open, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, but the majority of countries in high school are still very much disrupted. It's better in the primary school grades. And that's also a very important lesson for the pandemic. In high school, it is easier to introduce digital alternatives. Students have more autonomy. They know how to structure their learning. They know, how to access resources, how to use digital devices. You can actually keep schools closed and keep learning going. But for primary students, for young children, if you close your school, you cut off students from their school life, from their social environment, from their social network. And it's much easier to recover learning losses than it's possible to recover social well-being of students now. And you can see that in the chart, where countries have to make choices. They typically have given, the opening of primary schools priority. You can see a lot of countries that have kept their primary schools open even in a difficult pandemic situation, because there's very little of an alternative. School is not just a place of learning. It's a very important place for student well-being, where you meet your friends, where you encounter sort of a kind of collegial environment. You take that away, particularly for disadvantaged students, that's kind of a very hard situation. And it's an important, message, I believe, for Chile as well. Chile is sort of the champion of social inequality, at least on many of our indicators. So if you close a school in a deprived area, in a difficult area, you're going to hit those students twice. First, they come from a disadvantaged background, and second, the school that can mitigate some of that is also no longer available now. So anyway, you can say most countries have learned that lesson, given priority to the young children, be a little bit more, rigid when it comes to higher levels of education. And what are the kind of consequences of school closures? There's the individual consequences, the social consequences. First of all, what have countries done? Actually, quite interesting. Some countries have made no adjustments. Countries like Chile have said, well, we have less time, so we focus on some subject areas. And Chile is not alone in this. Many countries have done that. And when they made choices, they typically said, well, let's focus on mathematics and reading, the foundations. But actually, in this crisis, sometimes, it was social and emotional skills that became so much more important. And in a way, I think if we did this again, maybe mathematics and reading are very important, but we probably, in another crisis, most countries would give social and emotional skills a greater value in this now. It's not what we have seen in the pandemic in the first year, but now you see countries thinking about it. Some countries have also, basically created, additional time. When you think, for example, Portugal and Brazil, they have extended the school year using part of the holidays. Some countries have, hired retired teachers to support students in extra hours on the weekends, sometimes in the evenings. There's been a lot of creativity in education systems to add more time to help students recover from the pandemic. We also know that assessing learning outcomes has become very critically important. When you are in a school, you see your students in front of you. Assessment is not so important. You know your students, you know where they are. Suddenly, when they are at home and you're disconnected from them, it's really hard for teachers to keep track of all of their students. Finding good ways to assess that has become very, very important. And you can see basically some countries had, established plans for that, given teachers tools for running their assessments. We have not seen that in Chile, also other countries not, but at the OECD, we believe it's very important. It's very important that teachers get better tools to see how different students learn differently. And maybe even after the pandemic, assessment should not come just from the outside, an external test. It should be a regular tool where teachers can see every day how different students learn differently and provide them with more granular feedback. But particularly in a context like the pandemic, it's not only an optional extra, it's really, really crucial for this. Let me move on to technology. Obviously, technology has become the lifeline for success. And you can see actually most OECD countries have very quickly introduced online learning platforms. Chile as well. That happened. I actually have been quite impressed by the kind of tools that Chile has introduced very quickly, like other countries. Sometimes we have seen take-home packages, television, mobile phones, radio, other distance learning modalities. One lesson that I took from this is that, countries that put all their hopes in one tool, like online learning, often didn't reach all students. Because some students didn't have the computers at home, didn't have the technology, didn't have the skills. Sometimes teachers were not very good in using those online platforms. Those countries that started out to see, what technology do students have in their home? How can we leverage it? They tended to be most successful. I was very, very intrigued by what happened in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where the people went around and said, well, students don't have a computer, but they have a mobile phone and they have television. So why don't we broadcast good educational content on television? And then we ask students to interact with their mobile phones. Peru, also very interesting kind of solutions around this. Some countries are very creative to not, use a technology and then roll it out to schools, but actually look at what is available in families. How can we leverage it? How can we utilize it? So that's been a really interesting lesson from the pandemic, that sometimes, we need to be adaptive. We need to be responsive to the reality rather than, assuming certain things. One thing that we have been very concerned about is, once again, how do we reach the populations most at risk? And I want to show you a chart that is not from Chile, because we don't have real-time data for Chile. I use some data from the United States, from an online learning platform. And what you see here is basically the intensity of the platform use by week. And what you can see, if you go from the left to the right, up to the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, students from all social groups, the students from wealthy families, you see them here in the blue line, the students from poor families in the light green line, the students from middle income families, they were all at the same point. So there was no social segregation by technology use. But then, at the beginning of March, the pandemic hit the United States. And you could see everybody declined use of technology. Technology was not really responsive. But then very quickly, the students from the wealthy families, they picked up again. And they got very quickly back to where they were before. But the students from the poor families dropped further and never recovered. This tells us, on average, things look fine. But often the kind of social divisions are in the detail. Often, unfortunately, online technology has amplified, not moderated, social inequality. That's why, in my view, it is so important to open schools as quickly as we can, because the alternative devices are not very good in reaching students most at risk. Here you can see some real-time data on this. Now, what have countries done on this? And actually, it's quite interesting. A lot of activities happen. Now, you can see, for example, here, most countries have subsidized computers for students now, or schools. 8 out of 10 countries in the OECD. Most have actually created flexible and self-paced platforms where students could learn at their own speed, access additional resources. Most have, improved infrastructure for learners in remote areas that previously were not well reached, supporting learners with disabilities. It's really interesting how much initiative the pandemic has unleashed to actually get technology to the people. You could almost ask yourself, why did we need a pandemic to make this happen? Shouldn't that have happened many years ago? And indeed, in some countries it did. You have countries like Estonia or the Czech Republic in Europe that have, had worked on this already, well before the pandemic. They were well prepared. When the pandemic hit, they had, the country quite well equipped with the necessary technology. Most countries did not. They were caught cold by the pandemic. We've also other countries, for example, the Netherlands and France in Europe have also interesting examples. For example, when the schools closed, everybody needed computers. Buying computers was very difficult, because everybody was buying computers. It became very expensive, very difficult to procure. Sometimes, the supplier said to schools, you need to wait 2-3 months. Well, you can't wait 2-3 months in education. So what did the Netherlands do? They went around and said, well, there are so many companies where so many computers are standing around. Why don't we collect them, bring them to schools, get them up to speed, and then everybody has a computer. And that's what they did. And so actually, within 10 days, after the pandemic had stuck and the schools were closed, children had a computer. France, students with special needs need a lot of extra support. Many, many good initiatives happened. So yeah, it was a difficult situation, but it has also unleashed a lot of creativity and initiative that we should value. And again, I hope, after the pandemic, we will have learned our lesson from this and will continue with this. Obviously, when you open school in a pandemic, you have to be extremely careful and extremely cautious. You have to reconcile the needs of students with the needs of adults. You have to keep schools safe. There's been a lot of initiative around this. You can see 8 out of 10 countries made adjustments to school or classroom physical arrangements. Basically, you couldn't accommodate all students. You had to reduce the number of students. You had to introduce social distancing, rearrange classroom, create closed bubbles, limit, public spaces. Now, that's obvious. A lot of reduction in extracurricular activities. I think that's a great pity, but was inevitable. You couldn't have students, doing sports and things. Now people do that in the outdoor. I think there are now possibilities for doing this, but at the beginning, all of that was shut down. School became a very kind of stale, academically focused enterprise. We lost a lot of the interesting extracurricular activity. Then, students were returning progressively and so on. Lots of arrangements have been made to keep schools safe. Some countries, have students wearing masks. Some do testing and so on for COVID. So I think, again, a lot of different arrangements to keep schools reasonably safe. Another question, of course, is, students, are not so badly hit by the pandemic. They never get severely sick or very rarely. It's a different story for teachers, particularly older teachers. So actually a lot of initiative happened there as well. You can see, for example, that generally teachers got prioritized in vaccination programs in many countries, here on the left side, and Chile is among them. In fact, I think Chile has done really well on the vaccination compared, with other countries in Americas and also in Europe. And there's some who have said, well, we'd like to give teachers priority, but everybody is waiting, so we do not want to make any priorities. It's a difficult choice that societies have to make, but you can see the majority of countries have realized the important role that teachers play and that they need to get priority access. Sometimes they have, grouped it by age, by level of education, by other dimensions and so on. So there have been some adjustments being made. But let me get back to the students and how students were supported during this pandemic. And this is not just about cognitive support, it's also about psychological support, about social support, about physical support. Very, very important. We have seen, for example, that there's been a lot of effort to provide remedial measures to reduce student learning gaps, extra tutoring, assessment of learning gaps, giving students from disadvantaged additional support. Really, I think, again, why did we need a pandemic? This should have happened always, We should always, attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. We should always ensure that resources are well aligned with needs. Some countries do that very well. If you look to East Asia, countries like Japan, even China, if you look to countries in Northern Europe also, but for most education systems, we're not very good in aligning resources with needs. The pandemic has pushed us to do better. One area where most countries struggled is on vocational education and training. We could see basically that's something that many countries did not know how to do well in this pandemic. Students who were not going towards academic pathways, that needed internships, workplace training. That was really, really difficult. And as I already highlighted, it is easier to recover learning losses than emotional needs. The relationships that are formed in school are very important. In fact, if you ask me, what is the most important aspect to pay attention to in a time of school closures? It is that every student has a daily contact with someone in the education system. It doesn't actually need to be a teacher. It just needs to be someone. That you as a student have someone who cares about you. who knows who you are and who you want to become, who supports your learning needs. Where education systems have put that in place, they recovered very quickly. Where education systems did not establish those relationships, it was very difficult for students to recover. Many students didn't even come back. No. It's about personal resources. No. It's about good programs and really paying attention to the social and emotional being. Relating to families and friends, I'm going to show you some data in a moment. Many countries have built digital programs to actually keep parents very closely involved during the pandemic. Teachers, I mentioned already, coping mechanisms. How do you actually provide psychological report? During this pandemic, teachers were not just instructors. Suddenly they had to be very good coaches, very good mentors, very good social workers, very good psychologists. In some education systems, that's what teachers do every day. Now, if you go to Singapore, if you go to Japan, if you go to parts of China, as a teacher, you are always a caretaker of the students. You teach maybe, 10, 12, 15 hours, and the rest you spend with students on other things, or you spend with your fellow teachers to discuss student needs. You are used to a very holistic role of taking care of students. Well, in Chile, you don't have so much time as a teacher for that. You spend a lot of time teaching. And in a pandemic, that suddenly is exposed. The pandemic needs that other part. If you know your subject and you know how your student learned that subject, but you don't know your students, well, in a pandemic, you're at a loss. So I think that's very important. And then, often students were very difficult to reach. That's also very important. Some countries put a lot of arrangements in place to, look after refugees, migrants, put school-based mechanisms in place to track them, to make modifications to ensure that water, hygiene, sanitation services are available, to get communities involved in this. A lot of arrangements being put in place, and I think that's very, very important, because in a city, you can do lots of things, but most of the students who were most at risk actually were very, very much excluded. Examinations and assessments, very controversial, very hot topic. You can see actually in Chile, we didn't see so much of a difference. But when you look, for example, to Spain or to Norway, suddenly they could not run their assessments and they asked teachers to make the judgments, and teachers were much more generous than the external examinations usually is. So you suddenly had a huge jump in graduation rate. Now you say as a student, oh, well, lucky, it's great. More students pass the exam. But, what do employers think about it? That may stigmatize a whole generation of students. Basically, people will say the exam is not worth, the paper. So, I think that's been a really bitter lesson for some countries, that once our exams are not designed to be, ready for a pandemic, we suddenly lose that possibility. And you can see actually some countries made adjustments to this. Some countries postponed the exam, including Chile. Some were able to conduct them. But again, I think we've learned during the pandemic, we need to rethink the way in which we accredit learning, because our standard mechanisms are not very resilient to change. How do we sustain learning experiences? Well, teachers obviously are key. And what you can see here is that in most countries, teachers were required to teach remotely during the school closures. Not so much in the early years, pre-primary education, because there, digital education is really difficult. But when you get to primary or secondary schooling, you can really see that in most cases, there was a good emphasis on getting teachers, involved and making sure that they're available. Often there were additional efforts. You can see basically, countries like Japan or New Zealand, they got retired teachers to serve back to help struggling students, or, countries like Belgium, the Czech Republic, Indonesia, they were giving students or teachers additional incentives, sometimes additional money to actually, help in the pandemic when you just need quickly more people. You can't hire, quickly teachers, but there are a lot of people in the system that you can reactivate. And we have seen good examples for that to happen. Now, I mentioned already the importance to also keep active contact with the parents. And you can actually see once again a lot of creativity around the world. Communication on e-school platforms, making phone calls to students or parents. Most countries have paid a lot of effort to this. Emailing to students, providing parents with digital resources, having video conferences, Zoom calls, lots of arrangements to actually keep parents on board. Because during the pandemic, education realized that this is not done by schools alone. You really need an active engagement of parents. Many parents have never done that. Many parents have not been ready for this. So suddenly, this became an entirely new task. In some countries, it worked really well. In other countries, it's much harder. Chile is sort of in the middle of this. It's not so easy for the Chilean education system to activate parents. Chile is sort of very much commodified education. Students have become consumers, parents have become clients, teachers have become service providers. And with that attitude, it's not easy to get parents on board. If you go to a country like Poland or Belgium or Ireland here at the top, it's a much more whole of society enterprise. So actually parents were much more ready, much more prepared to engage themselves. But again, I think that's a lesson that we have learned also for the future. Supporting teachers, once again, this was absolutely crucial. And you can see basically there has been a lot of investment in teacher capacity on how to adapt content for teaching in a remote environment very quickly. It's been a crash course for educators to use new technologies to adapt curriculum. And probably, we're just at the beginning. In this crisis, most teachers have used technology to conserve existing practice. They did their lectures on Zoom. In the future, we need to use technology better to transform learning practice. And we have not seen so much of that happen during the pandemic. Let me conclude with one more aspect, and that is about money. Always important in this. You can see actually, and the good news is in most countries, actually during the pandemic, people realized this is the most important thing. Our education today will be our economy, our society tomorrow. So we need to redouble our investment in this. And in the last school year and in this school year, we have seen big increases in investment in the majority of countries for which we have data. For Chile, it's not so clear. Some people say it's increased the resources. Other people say, well, it's taken money on other parts away. Probably, we don't expect changes for Chile. But in the majority of countries, actually, I think we have seen a big effort being made by public authorities to ensure that education has the resources that it needs so that students can recover academically and socially and emotionally. But, it looks very good. Most countries are in the green area, putting additional money into this. But, we have seen the same picture in the, financial crisis. You can see here when the economies declined, that's the blue line, in 2007, 2008, money for education actually went up, like it does in this crisis. But then afterwards, when the economies had already recovered, people said, oh, we need more money for the economy and for other things, so we cut it on education. And then education money, the green line, declined a lot after the financial crisis. So I worry about it. I think the positive data that we have for last year and for this year should not make us elusive that, it's going to be very hard to ensure that countries will be ready to invest in their future. Policymakers tend to prioritize the urgent over the important. And there's a great risk that we see the same kind of picture after this pandemic. Let's hope not, but I think we should have this as a reminder. Very last point, it's, the decision-making power. We've seen a really interesting change in education. Normally, decisions are kind of equally distributed, between the center, the regions, the local municipalities, the schools, and so on. In the pandemic, we have seen a centralization of decisions when it comes to closing and opening schools, because you sort of need, some criteria that are reliable, that are predictable anywhere in the country. When it comes to resources, actually, you can see many actors have chipped in. When money was needed, the local communities, the regional governments, the schools, the countries. And when it comes to, adapting teaching practices, we have really understood in a moment of crisis, you need a lot of, creativity and capacity at the front line. You cannot, micromanage it from afar. You really need to have, and you can see that here. In the chart, you can see the green bar, the school really became a lot more prominent. So it's not an easy picture. This crisis has severely disrupted education. I think there's no question around this. But also, I think we have seen many, many interesting initiatives. We have never seen the level of social innovation, of technological innovation than in the last year. And maybe some of this will be there for the good, for the better, for the long-term development of our education systems. And with that, I will close. I see that my time is up and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Schleicher. Vamos entonces inmediatamente a continuar con preguntas que ya han llegado muchas, por cierto, y muchas gracias por su interesantísima presentación. La primera pregunta que hemos recibido está formulada por Alejandra Ratia. Ella es doctora en Educación, especialista en currículum y es la actual directora ejecutiva de la Fundación Educación 2020. Alejandra hace la siguiente pregunta. ¿Cómo cree que podemos transformar la pandemia en una oportunidad para avanzar en las innovaciones que nuestro sistema educativo necesita, especialmente en términos de una visión del aprendizaje más pertinente y significativa para los desafíos del mundo actual? ¿Y cómo ve los desafíos para equilibrar de mejor manera la evaluación interna y la externa para este propósito? Damos la palabra.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think if our education systems knew what the educators and the students and the school leaders know, we would have solved this problem. The problem that is often there is that we always look upwards. We never look outwards. And I do think, we are always, pushing a lot of ideas into schools and classrooms. We are not so good in finding the good ideas and scaling and spreading and sharing them. For me, that's a big part of the solution to your question. We need to become better in education to see the good ideas and to create a stronger profession to mobilize and share good practice, good ideas. Create, fewer vertical kind of lines of, communication and create more lateral lines of collaboration, stronger teacher professional collaboration, stronger school networks. I know in Chile that is very hard because your school system is very atomized, very stratified. I know that is very hard in Chile, but I do think that is, the only answer in the long run to have better kind of knowledge mobilization across the system. Innovation and good ideas are always born at the front line. The most important changes in our societies, they are born at the margins of our societies, not in the mainstream. And to be aware of that, to be open to those kinds of changes requires, that education system, and I think the same is true for our students. Every day we teach students the established wisdom of our times. Well, in the time in which we live, we should, help students better question the established wisdom of our times. Being open to the novelty, being open to not just learn, but also to unlearn and relearn when the time changes. The same for teachers. I don't think, you can train teachers to be innovative, or you can train teachers to be ready for the future. You need to make school a place where everybody learns, where teachers learn, students learn, the school learns, the work organization changes. And again, this is not a dream. This is what we see in some of the highest performing education systems today. That's why they were so quick in the pandemic to change, because they've changed the philosophy of their education system. They really sort of look at how we can prepare young people for their future rather than our past with a new kind of work organization. So I think it's not an easy road. I don't think, innovation will just be done somewhere and then, transmitted to schools. No, I think you have to make the education system more open to innovation. That's the only way. Silicon Valley doesn't work because you have someone top down spreading new ideas, but it's because you've created an ecosystem of innovation where new ideas are shared, mobilized, contested, refined, and so on. I think we need to do that better in education, and I think we can. It's not an easy way, but I think it's the only, and the pandemic has really illustrated that. That's sort of and when it comes to evaluation, I think you need both. You need a comparative perspective that helps you look outwards, but you also need a perspective of evaluation that is really owned by the profession, where teachers, have a good sense of the criteria that they are used. So I think really you need a good balance between a comparative and a student-specific approach to evaluation. Maybe technology will help us develop that in the future. No?
Muchas gracias. Vamos a hacer una segunda pregunta que es realizada por Paulina Araneda. Ella es la presidenta del Consejo de la Agencia de la Calidad de la Educación, quien además hace llegar el mensaje de que considera muy visionario, moderno y acorde a las necesidades actuales que la educación superior piense en pro del país y de las trayectorias de educación de sus habitantes, una visión audaz para lo que hoy el país requiere de las universidades. Le agradecemos su observación y vamos con su pregunta, que dice: en el contexto actual, en que hemos develado inequidades y brechas en los procesos educativos y de aprendizaje de niños, niñas y jóvenes de nuestra región, en su opinión y desde su trabajo en la OCDE, ¿cuáles son pasos relevantes en pro de proteger que cada estudiante tenga derecho a una trayectoria efectiva, logros de aprendizaje que el currículum establece, y plena acceso a un proceso formativo que fomente el desarrollo personal, social, capacidad reflexiva y como ciudadanos?
Yeah, first of all, the pandemic has not created inequalities. The pandemic has just dramatically amplified the structural inequalities in our education systems. If you look carefully, most of the sources of inequality have been there before the pandemic. We have just been very tolerant to them. And I must say, I think Chile is quite tolerant to inequality. If you were living in, let's say, Estonia or Denmark or Sweden, people would not be tolerant to the level of social inequality and educational inequality that you could see in Chile. People would intervene very quickly. In Finland, the closest school is always the best school, because the country, when they see that students fall behind, they will do whatever it takes to help those students recover. So I think those kinds of that attitude is very, very important. How tolerant are we to disparities? Do we teach every student in the same way? That almost automatically means that some students will fall behind because not everybody learns in the same way. Do teachers understand how different students learn differently and embrace that diversity with differentiated educational practice? Many education systems, and now, of course, how do we take steps to equity? Some has to do with resources. I think we should align resources with the needs. Many countries are introducing formula-based funding. So if you're a school and you have more difficult students, students from poorer backgrounds, with less educated families and so on, you get more money. So you have more opportunities to give those young people the best possible teachers. That's sort of the resource question, and I think it's important. The second part is the teaching talent question. If you go to Shanghai in China, the PISA top performer. If you are a vice principal in a high-performing school, you've been very successful, and you say to yourself, I want to become the principal, the education system will always tell you, if you want to advance, take on one of the toughest schools. Show that you can actually turn it around. And if you're successful, we're going to promote you to become the principal. So they will always get the best teachers to the most difficult classes. They will always get the best principals to the toughest schools. That's also important. That's not about the quantity of resources. It's about the quality of resources. And those things are easy to do. I think creating a formula-based funding system is a political decision, but it's not very difficult technically to do. And it has huge implications. Actually, if you want to improve Chile's education performance, if you spend more money on the wealthy children, you're not going to change very much, because money doesn't make that much of a difference for wealthy children. If you come from a wealthy family, you'll always find open doors in your life. You'll always be successful. If you come from a poor family, you have only one single chance in your life, and that is to meet a good teacher and to be in a good school. So if you want to raise performance, link resources with needs. But that's the easy part. The hardest part is to do that same in the pedagogy. And that really means that our education systems need to be much more nuanced to the strengths that students bring with them. And this is not just cognitive skills. Now, some students may have, very strong social skills, may have many important emotional qualities. And in the future, those things matter even more than the cognitive skills. Courage, leadership, empathy. So I think as a teacher, if you're very, very good in understanding your students, their kind of, possibilities, their interests, their motivations, and you can foster this, you can find a different pathway to every student. That's really where the inequality at the heart of education in the classroom can really be addressed. And that's very difficult, because that requires a lot from teachers. Personally, I think that's where the greatest potential of technology lies. Teachers can use learning analytics to assist them in understanding how different students learn differently and giving students additional tools. Students, we should get away from the logic of, special needs students are a small group of students. In Chile, you would say, yeah, we have about 7% of students with special needs. Well, in Denmark, they would say, we have 100% of students with special needs. Now, everybody needs a special attention. Everybody learns differently. Everybody has special talent. We need to find the extraordinary talents of ordinary students. But that's the hardest part. I think the resource question is the easy answer to your question. The pedagogical question is one, I think, where, it will take time to introduce that mind shift. We have, introduced a very industrial way to educating. We put everybody through the same system, the same curriculum, the same approach to teaching, the same pedagogy. And then we get surprised that some students are not very successful. The future is a much more personal, individual, and relational experience of learning.
Muchísimas gracias por la respuesta y muchísimas gracias a todos y todas por la gran cantidad de preguntas que nos han llegado. Esto refiere sin duda al enorme interés en esta temática y en esta presentación. Por el tiempo, vamos a hacer una pregunta más de la que hemos recibido para dar paso a la última pregunta que va a hacer la rectora antes de cerrar. Y esta pregunta tiene que ver con los docentes y el tema justamente del apoyo que necesitan en temas de salud mental. Entonces dice que junto con agradecer la ponencia, quisiera saber cuál es la relevancia del apoyo en salud mental para docentes y cómo se ha concretado esto en los países con más avances en estos tópicos.
I think it's a very important question. In this moment of crisis, many teachers have been left completely on their own with tasks they have never been prepared for, and they, may have never imagined when becoming a teacher, to become a social worker, to encounter real, emotional needs of students, to become, a psychologist, to become a mentor of students. I think this has been a deeply challenging time. And some people react to this by saying, okay, we have figured out the problem. Now we need to include that in teacher training. Maybe that's a good thing to do. I don't think it's going to solve the problem, because once again, the future will always surprise us. I think the answer really lies in changing our work environment, to give teachers more space, more time to connect with their colleagues, to have very strong professional links, where teachers work together to discuss student needs, where teachers work together to design new pedagogies, where teachers work together to become researchers for new technologies. And I think that's, the way how teachers, together as a profession can address those issues, that you're not alone in this. There's a profession around you, to whom to connect, to whom to consult. So I think that for me, but that's, my own view on this, that is the answer to this question, to create a more collaborative culture in education. There are two things that you need to become resilient. One is professional autonomy, to have the trust of parents, of the system to actually, take on difficult tasks. You need some professional competence, but you also need a much more strongly collaborative culture. Our school systems have become very atomistic. There's a lot of prescription in the system, but at the end of the day, when you close the doors in the classroom, you're left on your own. And I do think that's what needs to change. I think what gives teachers strengths is really the network of teachers around them. Where I learned it first was actually many years ago when Japan was struck by the tsunami. I worked on a recovery project in the area of Fukushima, where the nuclear kind of problems occurred. And when I met the teachers there, I was absolutely amazed how in this kind of devastating situation, 20,000 people had died. The whole region was, destroyed. Nothing was remaining. No school building had survived that kind of tsunami. Why were they working in their schools? What made them optimistic? Why they were recovering? Why did they have the emotional strength to rebuild the school system? Because they were connected as a profession. They had their colleagues around them. They had the same experience, and they were all sort of being able to rely on each other. And I think that's what we miss in our school systems today. That's my take on this.
Muchas gracias. Y como lo anunciamos, una última pregunta que va a realizar nuestra rectora.
Gracias. Bueno, en primer lugar, agradecer muy sinceramente. Ha sido una excelente conferencia, una conferencia muy interesante, Andreas, así que muchísimas gracias. Y quiero tener la oportunidad de volver a preguntarte una pregunta más general sobre Chile. Esta es una gran oportunidad de tener un diálogo directo sobre la situación de nuestro país. Tú conoces muchísimo los sistemas educativos de nuestra región y de muchos países, de todo el mundo. Y Chile, siendo el mejor país de América Latina, como es conocido y está en los diagnósticos la OCDE, tú mismo lo has resaltado en esta presentación, y luego de algunos años en que pareció que íbamos en una trayectoria ascendente, se ha estancado, ¿sí? Se ha estancado y el sistema educativo, uno tiene la sensación que no avanza, a pesar de que hemos implementado muchísimas reformas en los últimos 3 años, y hemos implementado tanto reformas en muchos ámbitos de acción, por así decirlo, tanto más institucionales como hacia los mismos profesores. Tenemos la sensación de que no ha sido suficiente y estamos estancados. Entonces, tener la oportunidad de preguntarte a ti, ¿cuál es tu visión? ¿Por qué se produce este estancamiento? ¿O cómo salimos de este estancamiento? La oportunidad de planteártelo muy directamente. Esa era la pregunta.
I think you know Chile much better than me. I only have a view on this through our comparative analysis, but let me make a couple of points. First of all, I think, in the pandemic, I believe that Chile has responded quite well. I think the priority you have given to reopening schools, I think, has been very important. Every day that school gets lost, some students fall further behind. And I know it's been a difficult decision, but I think to do whatever it's possible to keep schools working, to give students a chance, an opportunity to learn, I think that has been very important. But I think, that's missing in the broader context of Chilean education. Every day, there has been, in my view, too little attention to the very large disparities that you find in the education systems, the social disparities, the economic disparities. And I think, if you want to see some transformative change, you will not see that just by, creating a new curriculum or, a new teacher education program or a new kind of structure. I think you need to address some of the problems at their heart, and that is, the fragmentation of the education system, the many different parts, the atomistic culture, the lack of, collaboration among schools. Now, I think you cannot, easily change those things from the top. You can do some things from the top. You can introduce, better, teacher guidelines, new curriculum, and I think most of these things have been done in Chile. And I think they have been done quite well. But I think, the next step, I think, really needs to be to create a system that is more owned by the professional practitioners. Where people in the classroom are not, exchangeable figures on an assembly line, but where they are really the designers of learning environments, where they own their professional practice, where they work with their colleagues to design, new innovative learning environments where they share their good ideas and their good practices. Some of this, you can introduce new technologies. If you go to Vietnam today, for example, what has made them so successful in education in a very short period of time? They have a digital platform where teachers share their lesson plans and projects and ideas. And, the more other teachers from other schools and other parts of the country use your own ideas, criticize them, implement them, improve them, the more you get recognition. So as a teacher, you're not just there to educate your own students, but you're part of the system. You're a contributor to the system. And at the end of the school year, your principal will ask you, how did you actually improve our education system? How did you take responsibility for the education system as a whole? I think you cannot easily bypass. If I look at the most successful education systems around the world, they have a very, very strong profession. They have teachers really who are at the, they're not just implementing what is given to them, but they really sort of have a very, very strong sense of ownership of their practice. And they see themselves as the protagonists of innovation, as the researchers, the designers. And that's really, I think, what, and they're also, willing to take collective responsibility, where, high-performing teachers, see it as attractive to go to a low-performing school. That's where they can make their career. That's where they get social recognition. That's where they get the best possible support. It's not simply as saying, if you go to a low-performing school, we give you a little bit more money. No, it's about, we're going to take care of your family. We are going to give you sort of the best people to help you accomplishing this challenge. And we're going to give you the recognition. If you succeed in that environment, we advance your career. I really think that is something, the quality of an education system can never be better as the quality of the work arrangements for its professionals.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias nuevamente, profesor Schleicher. Estamos llegando al final de esta inauguración de Año Académico de Universidad de las Américas. Y junto con volver a agradecer también a todos y todas quienes han estado presentes hoy, agradecer las preguntas, intentamos sintetizar al máximo para poder escuchar las respuestas del profesor. Y queremos dejarlos invitados en lo que viene a nuestras actividades que podrán encontrar las fechas en nuestro sitio web www.udla.cl y a través de nuestras redes sociales. Así es que, sin más, los dejamos invitados, volvemos a agradecer y les deseamos que tengan un excelente